She answered a call in Italian in front of Mafia boss. Hours later, he said, "Don't let her leave." The frigid February wind cut through my thin jacket like a blade as I rushed toward the entrance of Dolce Vita, the exclusive Italian restaurant where I'd been employed for exactly 97 days. My fingertips were numb, my cheeks stinging from the cold, and my carefully arranged hair now hung in disheveled strands around my face. I was running 15 minutes behind schedule for my evening shift. "Emma, where have you been?" Marco, the assistant manager, snapped as I hurried through the kitchen entrance, hastily tying my black apron around my waist. His expression was unusually tense, something I'd rarely witnessed in the typically composed man. "Table 12, VIP section. You're assigned to them tonight." "What?" "But that's usually Sarah's area," I protested, struggling with the apron strings. Marco gripped my shoulders firmly, his fingers pressing with urgency. "Sarah called in with food poisoning. Listen carefully, Emma. These guests are extremely important. Absolutely crucial. Don't make any mistakes." The gravity in his voice made my stomach knot with anxiety. I nodded quickly, smoothing my black skirt and tucking loose hair behind my ear. This job was my lifeline. 8 months ago, I'd escaped Chicago with nothing but a suitcase and my meager savings, fleeing an ex-boyfriend whose possessive behavior had escalated into something terrifying. New York was meant to be my sanctuary, but fresh beginnings came with a steep price tag, and my cramped studio in Brooklyn consumed most of my earnings. "Who are they?" I asked, grabbing my order pad. Marco's eyes darted nervously around the busy kitchen. "Associates of Mr. Romano." My blood turned to ice. Everyone employed at Dolce Vita knew about Mr. Romano, the enigmatic owner who rarely graced us with his presence, but whose name was spoken in hushed tones filled with both reverence and fear. I'd never encountered him personally, but whispers circulated constantly. Some claimed he was merely a wealthy restaurateur. Others suggested connections to more dangerous enterprises, and they're waiting in the private dining room at the back. Remember, Emma, professional, efficient, and invisible. Invisible. That had become my specialty recently, keeping my head down, blending into the background, becoming part of the scenery in whatever environment I found myself. I took a steadying breath and pushed through the kitchen doors. Dolce Vita's main dining area glowed with warm amber lighting, crystal stemware reflecting the illumination from ornate chandeliers, pristine white linens contrasting against polished mahogany floors. It radiated old-money elegance, the kind that didn't need to announce its presence ostentatiously. I navigated through the dining room with practiced grace, spine erect, chin elevated, exactly as I'd been trained. Past the main seating area, down a narrow hallway to the exclusive private dining room reserved for distinguished guests, I paused at the heavy oak door, my heart thundering in my chest. Then I knocked once softly and entered. The private dining space was more dimly lit than the main restaurant, the lighting golden and intimate. A large circular table dominated the room, surrounded by 6 men in suits that probably cost more than my quarterly rent. Their conversation ceased abruptly as I entered, and 6 sets of eyes focused on me. But only one gaze captured mine and held it captive. He occupied what was unmistakably the position of authority at the round table, though logically a circular table shouldn't have a head. Dark hair, impeccably styled, sharp jawline shadowed with precisely groomed stubble. A suit that wasn't merely expensive, but appeared custom-tailored to his broad shoulders, as if it had been created specifically for him and him alone. But it was his eyes that paralyzed me completely. Dark, penetrating, and utterly cold. He appeared younger than I'd anticipated for someone who commanded such obvious deference, perhaps mid-30s at most. I immediately lowered my gaze, feeling heat creep up my neck. "Good evening, gentlemen. I'm Emma, and I'll be serving you this evening. May I begin with beverage orders?" I moved around the table systematically, taking drink requests, hyper-aware of the headman's eyes tracking my every movement. When I reached him last, he didn't immediately respond to my inquiry about his beverage preference. "You're new here," he stated, his voice low and smooth with a barely detectable accent I couldn't identify. It wasn't a question, but an observation. "Yes, sir. 3 months now," I replied, pen poised over my notepad. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Whiskey. Neat." I nodded and turned to leave when the door opened, and a man in a dark suit entered, nodding respectfully to the table before approaching the headman. He leaned down and whispered something urgent in his ear. The headman's expression remained unchanged, but something in his posture shifted, a new tension settling across his shoulders. I slipped out quietly, releasing a breath I hadn't realized I was holding once I reached the hallway. Something about that room, about him, made the atmosphere feel suffocating. I hurried to the bar to place the drink orders. When I returned with the tray, the room's atmosphere had transformed dramatically. Voices were lower, expressions more serious. I distributed the drinks silently, attempting to remain as unobtrusive as possible. As I placed the whiskey before the headman, my phone vibrated in my apron pocket. I never accepted personal calls during work hours, but with my grandmother in hospice care back in Italy, I'd kept my phone activated constantly for the past 10 days. After serving the final drink, I stepped back against the wall and discreetly checked the screen. It was the nursing facility's number. My heart lurched painfully. I'd been anticipating this call while simultaneously dreading it. I glanced at the table. They were absorbed in intense discussion, papers scattered between them. I took 2 quiet steps toward the door and answered softly. "Pronto," I whispered, the Italian escaping automatically as it always did when speaking to anyone from home. The nurse's voice came through gentle but regretful, delivering the news I'd been expecting but wasn't prepared to hear. I ended the call, blinking back tears. When I opened my eyes, the entire table had fallen silent, all attention focused on me. But the headman's gaze was different now, sharper, more concentrated, as if seeing me for the first time. I realized with sinking dread that I'd spoken fluent Italian in front of them. "I apologize for the interruption," I stammered, slipping my phone back into my pocket. "Would you like to order your meals now?" The dinner proceeded with agonizing slowness. I moved in and out of the room, bringing courses, refilling glasses, clearing plates. Each time I entered, I felt the headman's eyes on me, following my movements with an intensity that made my skin prickle with unease. Once, when I leaned between 2 of the men to place a dish, I caught a hint of his cologne, something woody and expensive that somehow conveyed power itself. By the time dessert and coffee were served, my nerves were completely frayed. The men had transitioned from business discussions to more casual conversation, some in English, some in Italian. I understood every word, but kept my expression carefully neutral as I'd been trained. Professional, invisible, part of the furniture. It was nearly midnight when they finally prepared to depart. I presented the bill in a leather portfolio, which the headman didn't even glance at before handing me a black credit card. When I returned with the receipt, he signed it with an illegible flourish, then held it out to me, his fingers lingering just a moment too long as I took it. "Grazie, Emma," he said, my name rolling off his tongue in perfect Italian. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and stepped back as they gathered their belongings. They filed out of the room, the headman last. At the door, he paused and looked back at me, his expression unreadable. "Buonanotte," he said, and then he was gone. I exhaled shakily and began clearing the table. The tip was extravagant, more money than I'd earned in 2 weeks. I pocketed it with trembling fingers, wondering why the encounter had left me so deeply unsettled. An hour later, I was finally finished cleaning. The restaurant had emptied except for a few staff members closing up. I untied my apron, exhausted to my core. Grief over my grandmother weighing heavily on my heart. I needed to book a flight to Italy, to attend her funeral, to say my final goodbye. But flights were expensive, and even with tonight's generous tip, I wasn't certain I could afford it. "Emma." Marco appeared beside me as I collected my coat. Mr. Romano would like to speak with you before you leave. My stomach plummeted. Mr. Romano, he's here? Marco gave me an odd look. Of course he was at table 12. The room spun slightly. The headman, the one whose eyes had followed me all night, who had watched me with such intensity after my phone call. That was Vincent Romano, the owner. The man whose name everyone whispered with a mixture of fear and respect. Marco led me to a small office at the back of the restaurant. He knocked once, then gestured for me to enter. With leaden feet, I stepped inside. The office was compact but elegant, with dark wood paneling and a desk that dominated the space. Vincent Romano sat behind it, jacket removed, white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. A single desk lamp cast shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He wasn't alone. A large man stood by the door, his stance wide, hands clasped in front, a bodyguard. "Sit, per favore," Romano said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. I sat, my spine rigid, hands folded in my lap to hide their trembling. Was I being fired for taking a personal call? For speaking Italian? For some mistake I hadn't even realized I'd made? "You speak Italian like a native," he said without preamble, his eyes never leaving my face. I swallowed hard. "I am a native, sir. I grew up in a small village near Florence. Yet your English has almost no accent." "My mother was American. I grew up bilingual." He nodded slowly, as if fitting pieces of a puzzle together. "And the call you received tonight, bad news from home, I assume." My eyes widened at his directness. "My grandmother passed away. The nurse said I should come as soon as possible if I wanted to attend the funeral." To my horror, tears welled in my eyes. I blinked them back furiously, not wanting to show weakness in front of this man. Something flickered across Romano's face, not quite sympathy, but perhaps understanding. He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a slim black folder, sliding it across the surface toward me. "Open it," he commanded softly. With hesitant fingers, I flipped it open. Inside was a first-class plane ticket to Florence, departing tomorrow afternoon, and an envelope that, when I peeked inside, contained more cash than I'd ever seen at once. I looked up at him, confusion and suspicion warring within me. "I don't understand." "I need someone who speaks fluent Italian to accompany me on a business trip. My usual translator has fallen ill. The trip is for 10 days to Florence and Rome. The ticket is yours, as is the advance payment, if you agree to work for me during this time." My mind raced. It seemed too perfect, too convenient. What would this work entail exactly? The corner of his mouth curved upward. "Translation during meetings, some light administrative work. Nothing beyond your capabilities, I assure you." I stared at the ticket, at the lifeline it represented. I could attend my grandmother's funeral. I could say goodbye properly. But at what cost? "Why me?" I asked, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "And there must be professional translators you could hire." Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I prefer someone authentic, someone who understands the nuances of both languages and cultures. And I find I prefer someone I've personally observed. Observed. The word sent a chill down my spine. How much did he already know about me? "You don't have to decide right now," he said, leaning back in his chair. "The flight leaves at 2 p.m. tomorrow. If you accept, a car will pick you up at your apartment at 11 a.m. My blood ran cold. He knew where I lived. "Employment records," he said smoothly, reading my expression. But something in his eyes told me there was more to it. I stood on unsteady legs, the folder clutched in my hand. "I'll think about it." He nodded. "But Emma," he added as I turned to leave, "your grandmother doesn't have much time before the funeral. Neither do you." The implied threat hung in the air between us. I hurried out of the office, past the bodyguard whose eyes tracked my movements, through the now empty restaurant and into the bitter night air. I was halfway home in a taxi when I realized what had just happened. Vincent Romano hadn't asked if I had a passport. He hadn't asked if I could get time off work. He hadn't asked anything about my life or circumstances. He'd already known everything he needed to know. And somehow, despite the alarm bells ringing in my head, I knew I would be in that car at 11 a.m. tomorrow. Not just for my grandmother, but because something in Romano's eyes told me that refusing wasn't really an option. Sleep evaded me that night. I tossed in my narrow bed, my mind cycling between thoughts of my grandmother, her gentle smile, the scent of rosemary that always lingered on her apron, the sound of her laughter echoing through our small kitchen, and the cold, calculating eyes of Vincent Romano. By dawn, dark circles shadowed my eyes, but my decision was crystallized. I would go to Italy. I would attend Nonna's funeral. Whatever came after, I would face it head-on. I packed methodically, my hands moving automatically while my thoughts raced. Practical clothes for business meetings, a black dress for the funeral, toiletries, passport, the envelope of cash I'd hidden in a hollowed-out book, emergency money I'd been saving since I left Chicago, just in case I needed to disappear again. At 10:45, I stood by my apartment window, watching the street below. The neighborhood wasn't upscale, but it was what I could afford. Across the street, a man in a dark coat leaned against a fire hydrant, smoking. He'd been there since I'd woken up, watching my building, watching me. At precisely 11 a.m., a sleek black town car with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. The man across the street straightened, dropped his cigarette, and spoke into what I now realized was an earpiece. My stomach twisted. Romano had been having me watched all morning, ensuring I wouldn't flee. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The car is waiting, Miss Chen." I swallowed hard, grabbed my suitcase and purse, and took one last look at my tiny apartment. For a moment, I considered not going downstairs, pretending I wasn't home. But the image of my grandmother's face floated in my mind, and I knew I had no choice. The February air bit through my coat as I stepped outside. The driver, a broad-shouldered man with a military bearing and impassive expression, took my suitcase without a word and opened the rear door. I slid into the back seat, half expecting to find Vincent Romano waiting inside. Instead, the car was empty, the black leather seats cool against my legs. "Where is Mr. Romano?" I asked as the driver pulled away from the curb. "Meeting you at the airport, Miss Chen," he replied, his eyes meeting mine briefly in the rearview mirror. At the airport, I was escorted past regular security through a private entrance I didn't know existed. No lines, no waiting, no removing shoes or laptops. The driver handed me off to a petite woman in a crisp suit who introduced herself as Angela, Mr. Romano's assistant. "He's waiting in the private lounge," she said, her expression professionally neutral as she led me through corridors I'd never seen despite having flown from this airport before. "Your luggage will be handled separately." The private lounge was nothing like the crowded waiting areas of the main terminal. Soft lighting, plush seating, a bar stocked with top-shelf liquor, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. And there, standing by those windows with his back to me, was Vincent Romano. He turned as we entered, and once again, I was struck by the sheer presence of the man. Today he wore a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb and reflect light in equal measure. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw freshly shaved. He looked like he'd stepped out of a luxury magazine, not a hint of the late night visible on his face. "Emma," he said, my name sounding different in his mouth than it ever had before. "I'm pleased you decided to join me." I clutched my purse strap tighter. "I need to attend my grandmother's funeral." Something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. Direct. "I appreciate that." He gestured to a seating area. "Please sit. We have some time before boarding." Angela disappeared, and I found myself alone with him, perched on the edge of a leather sofa while he sat across from me, completely at ease. A server appeared with coffee, espresso for him, a cappuccino for me. I hadn't told anyone my coffee preference. "I took the liberty of having some clothes sent to the plane for you," he said, watching me over the rim of his cup. "Business attire appropriate for the meetings we'll be attending." My spine stiffened. I brought clothes. "I'm sure you did," he replied, his tone making it clear what he thought of my wardrobe. "These are simply additional options. Consider it part of your compensation." I wanted to refuse, to tell him I didn't need his charity, but something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't charity. This was control. "When will I be able to attend my grandmother's funeral?" I asked, changing the subject. He set down his cup. "We arrive in Florence tomorrow morning. You'll have the afternoon free to attend the service. After that, I'll need you for a dinner meeting." I nodded, relief washing through me. At least he wasn't going to keep me from her immediately. "Now," he continued, leaning forward slightly, "let's discuss what I expect from you during this trip." For the next 20 minutes, he outlined my duties, translating during meetings with Italian business associates who preferred not to speak English, accompanying him to dinners and social functions, handling some correspondence. Nothing that seemed outwardly inappropriate. Yet the undercurrent of his words, the way his eyes never left mine, the implicit understanding that I was now in his orbit, made my skin prickle with unease. "Do you have any questions?" he asked when he'd finished. 1,000, but only one that mattered. "Why me? Really?" He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim folder, placing it on the coffee table between us. "Open it." With hesitant fingers, I flipped it open. Inside was a photograph of me taken 2 years ago at my college graduation. I was smiling, arm around my grandmother, who had flown in from Italy for the ceremony. Next to it was a copy of my degree in international business from NYU. Then came pages of what looked like a background check. Previous addresses, employment history, even my credit score. The final page made my blood run cold. A police report I'd filed against my ex-boyfriend in Chicago, with photographs of the bruises he'd left on my arms and neck. My hands trembled as I closed the folder. "How did you get this?" "I make it my business to know who works for me, Emma." His voice was softer now, almost gentle, but his eyes remained sharp. "Even those who serve drinks in my restaurants." "This goes beyond knowing your employees," I said, anger momentarily overriding my fear. "This is an invasion of privacy." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Privacy is a luxury few can truly afford." He took the folder back, tucking it into his jacket. "To answer your question, I chose you because you're qualified, you're desperate, and you have no connections that would make you a security risk." "No connections," I protested. "I have family." "A deceased grandmother," he cut in. "No parents. Both died in a car accident when you were 15. No siblings. No serious relationship since you fled Chicago. Few friends in New York." His eyes bored into mine. "You keep to yourself, work hard, send money to your grandmother's care facility every month, and try to be invisible." His words hit like physical blows, each one stripping away another layer of the anonymity I'd worked so hard to maintain. "But you were never invisible to me, Emma." A chill ran down my spine. How long had he been watching me? Since I started at the restaurant, before. "Our flight is ready," he said, standing abruptly. "Shall we?" In a daze, I followed him through another private exit, directly onto the tarmac where a sleek private jet waited, its engines already humming. No commercial flight, despite the first-class ticket he'd shown me. Of course not. Men like Vincent Romano didn't wait in boarding lines or sit among strangers. The interior of the jet was all cream leather and polished wood, with only 8 seats that looked more like thrones, plus a lounge area and what appeared to be a private bedroom at the rear. 2 flight attendants greeted us with deferential smiles. A man who could only be another bodyguard sat near the front, his bulk barely contained by his suit. And to my surprise, Angela was already seated, typing on a laptop. Make yourself comfortable, Vincent said, gesturing to a seat. It's a long flight. I sank into the buttery leather, acutely aware that I was now truly trapped, 30,000 feet in the air in a private jet with a man who had been investigating me for God knows how long. A man who, if the rumors about him were true, was not just a restaurant owner, but someone with dangerous connections. Once we reached cruising altitude, a flight attendant brought champagne, which I declined, and then a garment bag, which she hung in a closet I hadn't noticed. Your additional wardrobe, Miss Chen, she said with a practiced smile. Vincent had moved to sit with Angela, their heads bent over documents, speaking too quietly for me to hear. I tried to distract myself with the book I'd brought, but the words swam before my eyes. Eventually, exhaustion from my sleepless night overtook me, and despite my anxiety, I drifted off. I woke to the gentle touch of a hand on my shoulder. For a disoriented moment, I thought I was back in my apartment. Then my eyes focused on Vincent Romano's face inches from mine, and reality crashed back. We're landing soon, he said, straightening. You should fasten your seatbelt. I blinked, looking out the window to see the familiar landscape of Tuscany spread below us, golden in the afternoon light. Despite everything, my heart lifted at the sight of my homeland. As the plane touched down, Vincent moved to sit across from me, his expression inscrutable. I will be staying at my villa in the hills, he said, straightening his cuffs. A car will take you to your grandmother's funeral this afternoon, then bring you back for the dinner meeting at 8. Not, I'll take you, but a car will take you. The distinction was clear. I would be transported like a package, where and when he wished me to go. I understand, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if he'd expected more resistance. Good. He handed me a small black phone. Keep this with you at all times. It's secure and has my number programmed in. If there's an emergency or if you need anything, use it. I took the device, another tether binding me to him. Thank you. The plane taxied to a private hangar where 2 black SUVs waited on the tarmac. As we disembarked, Vincent placed his hand lightly on the small of my back, guiding me down the stairs. It was the first time he had touched me, and even through my coat, his hand burned like a brand. Welcome back to Italy, Emma, he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. Welcome home. What I didn't know then was that by the time I returned to Vincent Romano's villa that evening, after saying goodbye to my grandmother for the last time, nothing would ever be the same again. The phone call I'd answered in Italian had changed the entire trajectory of my life, binding me to a man whose dark world would become mine, whose dangerous love would consume me, and whose protection would become both my salvation and my prison. As the car drove away from the airfield toward the Tuscan hills, I stared out at the landscape of my childhood and wondered if I would ever be free again. Or if, perhaps, freedom was overrated when weighed against the intoxicating presence of a man who looked at me as if I were the answer to a question he'd been asking his entire life.